So we're here in my kitchen and we are at this beautiful table which I bought actually in I think 95 on a flea market for 50 bucks, Deutschmarks that time. The great thing about this thing is that it's very, very old now and it's been mended many, many times by different guests of the house, and it can extend. So, you know, there's lots of space to work and eat and celebrate and stuff like that. And I always like to sit here because I have all the drawings of my kids in my back, which is nice to know, and I have a clean wall in front of me. The interesting thing for me at the moment is that there is not one scene, and what I find really interesting is that you have, there's two ways of looking at it for me. There is the people who have been here for a long time and who want to stay here, and the people who come here for a short-term experience, which could be between, I don't know, 2 and 10 years, let's say. And they have very, very different energies and very, very different dynamics. And so for example, the people who come for a shorter time, they bring incredible energy, and there is a moving and a shoving and a pushing and a doing and a organizing. And it's almost like in a Durchlauferhitzer, you know, when you kind of induce extra heat somehow. And the people who live here and want to stay living here have a completely different energy resource. So we have to kind of see how we can actually spread ourselves for a long time. So, and this is interesting, and I think both profit from each other. So this is one side to look at it, and the other part to look at it is that scene used to be, you know, the independent scene versus the employed, and so on and so forth, or the free scene as opposed to the institutions. Actually, we are living in a time which I find super interesting, where it's not that clear-cut anymore, where people who are freelancers also work for big institutions and vice versa. And that's also something where I find it becomes interesting not to think in exclusivenesses anymore and in oppositions anymore. So the question is more how the scene actually generates itself through specific practices that are different when they work in different locations, let's say. So I think that for me the idea of asymmetry also comes from shifting my understanding of artistic work and artistic practices from an economical to an ecological one. And I think in an economical one there is always this desire to assimilate, to appropriate, to make readable, to make the same. And even if something is sold through the argumentation of a lack and a generation of desire, the currency is the same. So, and I think the interesting thing with an ecological point of view would be that in an ecological point of view you have to understand that things are different anyway, and they become more different by being entangled with each other. So there is a nature of coexistence and codependence that defines an ecology. And this idea of the ecology of artistic practice, you can apply it to a scene, you can apply it to the work process, you can apply it to the production, let's say, and the performance. With a lot of artistic practices that are happening now in the freelance / self-organized scene, is that these hierarchies are still in place, but they rotate. So you have something like somebody who is the organizer can also be the performer for somebody else, or somebody who is like following a friend's work, let's say, through feedback and through being together with also developing source, like conceptually and so on, can ask that same friend to become the dramaturg for their show, like things like this, where people just start rotating, where positions are not anymore established as what they exemplify in the kind of normal apparatus, but become practices. So I'm engaging in the practice of performing, I'm engaging in the practice of dramaturging, I'm engaging in the practice of making and taking the decisions alone, or collaborating, taking decisions together. So this, I think this is something where the difference arises. So there's two differences. There is the difference between accepting the hierarchies and the asymmetries, and on the other hand, the difference between places where these hierarchies need to be stabilized and places where these hierarchies can rotate. We have to keep with the asymmetrical relationships because this is what produces dynamics. I think this is what's really interesting, that if it's all about being the same, there is actually no fluxes at all. So what is interesting is actually to identify the difference, and this is what for me an ecological approach does, is that I see that we might inhabit the same place, but we are actually using it completely differently. I think also the one thing about the ecological thought is that it produces difference and it produces strangeness, and it produces the idea and the experience of allowing the other to stay strange. So it's not an assimilation at all. It's really maybe a dissimilation, or it's something that I thrive on this difference. Asking again and again, what is the strangeness? How does the strange actually affect me? How do I let myself becoming affected by the strangeness of a stranger or of this colleague that I choose to work with because they are different than I am, because they think differently than I am. The political body, in order to be political, needs two things, which is a critical mass and at least one political claim that they can agree on. And then it can be devised by very different practices and kind of produce more political claims that also could be diverse, but there has to be at least one that, you know, everybody wants to sign. A specific concept gathers different approaches around it and activates this entire group of people. So this is, I think, this is an interesting idea to think, how can you propose something? And I see more and more projects like that happening. I do a lot of teaching working around, so every time one of my practices is to hijack invitations and to kind of become like a parasite to all the invitations that I get to keep developing my practice. But that of course becomes also a virus to these places. So then there is little pockets of people, you know, starting to engage with the question of ecological thought, with different practices that can start to be activated within it. The interesting thing about ecological practices for me is that they are the ones that are very kind of clean cut and simple to describe, like we are, as I said before, we are in the same scene, so we accompany each other for ages and see and kind of become different positions to each other's work. But then there's others that I think aren't that clear cut, which are more about how to induce something and see what happens. So it's more like, okay, how can I make a proposition and then see how people are going to pick it up? And of course that always requires one or two or three people to keep going, because they have to create the platform that actually becomes the table that people meet at. I talked about this love practice as almost like a general description of my practices, which is, and then trying to define its parameters. What does it actually mean? And one of the things for me is to find out what is close enough to be as close as I can, and how far do I need to stay away in order to not overwrite, and overdetermine my partner, whatever this is, whether it's a collaborator, an audience, a material, a concept, whatever. So that's one thing. I think this distance and this kind of negotiating distance is really, really part of the practice that I would call love practice. The other thing is that to not take decisions in advance. The plan is to stay as close as you can, as far as you can, for as long as you can. And that also brings immediately the question of when does this come to an end? And there's always a natural end. So there's the end of disinterest. That's also how you disengage with the practice. You just lose interest. Or it's not like you can fulfill a practice. There's never a fulfillment of a practice. It's just the practice only exists as long as you pursue it. And then the interesting thing is that so you lose interest, or an incident happens, or it's just that the time is up because you set to yourself a certain time or something. So, but this thing about the decisions, I think, is interesting because you need to endure the uncertainty until a question actually arises. But I think one thing we can really learn from artistic practices, also as political beings, is to actually have this agency of endurance, in the sense of, if I learn to endure uncertainty, if I learn to endure, not uncertainty actually, but the condition of not knowing, that is always going to be there, no matter how much other stuff I know, there's always a condition of unknowing, then I can actually also deal with political questions out there, you know. So in a way, I also find what the art scene can give to a society is practicing this muscle of endurance, of agency of endurance, which of course brings up ethical questions, of course brings up social questions, and so on and so forth, but not just in the practices that we practice, that we do, that we share, but also in formats that we invite audiences to come in. And maybe that's another practical example that you were asking about, is this thing of, so what kind of formats can we devise that are in place to share work with an audience that is not the consumable product. And I think this, for me, all of these again asymmetries, to produce them consciously and open up a space where we can actually negotiate them consciously also and experience them consciously, might hopefully, or this is at least what I do with my practice, and I know a lot of artists around me do it, really have a political claim that is not about politics, but is actually almost like a training muscle for this politics for a very complicated time, actually. So-called queer practices are really important, and with queer practice I really don't mean queer aesthetics. That's part of it, sure, but queer aesthetics becomes, as soon as it becomes predictable, it's not actually queer anymore as in a methodology. I mean, queer is basically based on lack and excess. The lack of the normative. It is not normative, it is not straight, it is queer, so it's lacking that, and it is excessive in other ways, which basically conditions the lack. So because it is excessive in other ways, it's producing a lack with regards to being normative or straight or traditional or whatever. So I think as soon as we can actually describe queer 101, that's not queer anymore. Then we're talking about queer aesthetics, and then we can make a catalogue of what it needs to make a queer performance or a queer event or whatever. But I think what is really so queer is a doing, and this is why it's queering the queer. Maybe queer is a doing in the sense that it has to constantly shift what the conditions of my experience are somehow. Whether it does that through time, whether it does that through through a mashup of contents and aesthetics, whether it does that through a mashup of audiences. That's, for example, also an interesting one. Like, when do you get your target audience, and what would it be to queer an audience actually? How to provide alternatives to the main career practices, or how you envision yourself as an artist, or what the career of an artist is. I mean, for me, it's been a journey, really, and I've got 4 different jobs that I would describe for myself. So I make performances. I teach at art universities, mostly in MA choreography courses. I'm active, or I'm a part in the development of other people's processes. And I teach rhetorics and negotiation in corporate companies. So these are 4 different jobs that I could say, in a traditional understanding, I haven't made it as an artist, so I need these other 3 jobs to survive. Positioning my work not as a monolithic self-expression or whatever, but always to kind of gather around a field of people that are interested and busy in the same question, and of course come up with completely different expressions. So it's not an aesthetic curation, or let's say invitation, but it's more a reflection of a similar question from within a field. I like to talk about this field, and I think that would be the answer to the question how to queer, or how much can one queer one's own artistic development. I mean, the problem with queering it is exactly that you can't be labeled. I mean, the normal career development would say, she's the one who does this and this, so we know if we need somebody like that, we invite her. According to my own definition of queerness, is that it is not predictable, that it is not accessible in the way that you can compartmentalize it and say this is that, but it actually is constantly fluid and excessive, or lacking. And so I guess I am queering my own career to my advantage or disadvantage, I don't know, but at the moment I'm quite enjoying that. The other thing is this question of when will I make it? I mean, that exactly is the opposite of a practice. Like, if I make it, I've reached a completion. I've reached at least a kind of completion in the eye of a public, or in the eye of a critic, or in the eye of the market. And I think this is something that is really changing, I have to say, and maybe it's changing mostly in Berlin, but this is the scene that I know best, is that being an artist has become work. Rather than, or the self-understanding of an artist is just to keep on working. How to actually keep on working and doing what you are interested in doing, and asking the questions that you're interested in asking, rather than wanting to have made it. I see a lot of mid-career artists who just want to keep working, and of course need their condition to do that. And again, to come back to the idea of ecology, coexistence, developing difference, experiencing the strangeness of strange, that is already enough to work with. And I think if you become aware that you're actually contributing to all of this, that you're part of this system, that you're developing the resistances, that you're making the differences, that you're also kind of producing strangeness that other people find strange / dangerous / weird, non-acknowledged, or imposing. Let's put it this way, because not just that art is doing all of these nice things at all. I mean, it's an imposition. It's an imposition to actually resist the the easy drive to solve problems. I think if we insist on producing problems and insist in actually enduring the problematics that we have, and not thinking what are the 3 steps that we can solve them in, then I don't need big things written with capital letters that can be my enemies. I mean, I think this is another problem, that a lot of argumentation comes from fear, because it produces the enemy. It produces the enemy, and this happens in politics, of course, but it also happens in the arts. And the interesting thing is not how to start to become active from fear, but how to become active because, in spite and through these differences.